Hello, and welcome to the first half of Chapter 9 of Cloak of Obscurity. Yes, Chapter 9's a long one. The Trial of Wahalyalea. News travels fast in Bell Camp. By the time I got back to the Snake and Egg, everyone knew about young Melly and how I'd saved her life. I heard Sadie's booming voice praising me before I walked in the door, and I was able to slip around back and upstairs without anyone seeing me. I was just too tired to talk about it. Besides, Sadie would have offered me supper, and I didn't know how to refuse without telling her that I'd been ordered to fast by the temple. Once safe in my room, I gnawed my humble dinner of dry bread I'd bought on the way home and fell into a sound, dreamless sleep. It was raining the next morning. The rain startled me. The weather had been dry for weeks, and as foolish as it sounds, I'd been so preoccupied I'd sort of forgotten it could rain in the summer. I needed to leave early for the trial. I dressed, choked down my morning allotment of black bread, tucked a small cloth pouch for Lee into my bag, threw on an oilcloth cape against the rain, and headed downstairs. I found Sadie, trussed into her best gown, pawing through a tumbled mass of chains, cords, and metal bits she had dumped onto an empty table. "Oh, I know it's here somewhere," she muttered as I approached. "What is?" I asked, peering over her shoulder. "My St. Rosalind," she answered. "Here, help me find it." I spent the next few minutes disentangling Sadie's collection of saints for all occasions, discovering medals for Saint Deborah, patron of weavers, favored saint of my family, and namesake of my eldest sister, Saints Corwin and Roland, Saint Katerina, virgin martyrs, Saint Anthony, sailors, the Archangel Tanis, healers, Saint Sarah, martyrs of conscience, and several medals for Saint Catherine, children, half-wits, and drunkards. Also a general-purpose talisman for wealth. It should really have been folded up in a chicken's claw, wrapped in black cloth, and hung from the southwest corner of the roof. Finally, I extracted the breastplate of St. Rosalind the Just. "Here," I said, teasing the worn chain from the leather thong of a St. Thaddeus. "You know, you really should have all these cleaned and anointed. I can do it for you if you like." "Oh, that would be dear of you, Eddie," she said. "Have you had breakfast?" Yes, I think we'd better leave now. People are going to want to watch this trial. It could get crowded, and we'll want to be up near the front. Besides, I promised Lee I'd stop by and see him beforehand." Naturally, Sadie insisted on bringing Lee some breakfast. She was not allowed to deliver it. So I took it in to him, along with the bag he'd asked for. He was pacing the tiny cell when I arrived. "Hey, don't look so worried," I said with a smile. "You'll be out of here for good by this afternoon." "One way or another," he said darkly. I snorted. "And just what do you mean by that?" "An elf always makes a convenient scapegoat," Lee said. "Suppose the king decides to hang me just to say he's done something." "I think old Harold is a bit more just than that," I reassured him. "Besides, you have an unimpeachable witness. If your king is willing to listen to an elf," Lee countered gloomily. I sighed. "Lee, you're innocent. The trial will prove that. Now eat your breakfast and cheer up. Remember, you have friends, and we'll be there to speak for you. Now I have to go. I need to get to the court hall early." As I'd suspected, the court was very crowded that day, in spite of the rain, or perhaps because of it. The king's courts were held in a huge hall near the castle, so it was out of the wet. Sadie and I were lucky to have set out as early as we had. Though we arrived 2 hours before the trial was set to begin, we wound up in the 5th row back, because the first floor were already crammed with curious spectators. More people kept arriving as we waited. I got tired of craning my neck to look back at them and just stood backwards, leaning against the bench in front of me. A king's court is held not only to determine the guilt or innocence of one suspect, but to also lay out as much evidence as possible about the crime. Everyone connected with Allison, her household, and the events of St. Michael's Eve would be questioned. If they were not present in the hall, unlikely, runners would be sent through the city to find them. I knew I would be questioned, and probably Sadie as well. I watched the wide rows of benches fill behind me, and then the raised galleries running down either side of the high-roofed hall. The rear balcony was reserved for the king's party. His Majesty could observe everything that went on from that vantage point, or go to sleep if he were bored and the people couldn't see him. King Harold arrived a few minutes before the trial was to start, ushered in by trumpets. After he was seated, the populace became much less noisy. Then the crowd turned as one from the royal balcony as the 3 chosen judges arrived and took their seats at the front of the hall. King's courts were usually heard and decided by 3 judges chosen from the leading classes of our kingdoms: the nobility, the guilds, and the temple. The peasantry and the elves were not represented. I did not recognize the guildsman, who was a glassblower, but the nobleman I knew to be Sir Cyprian of Seaford, Duke of the King's Northern Army. He was a veteran of the last Elven uprisings, as well as all the recent border disputes with all of our neighbors. He was of an age with my father, and much the same size and shape as well. He bore a paunch worthy of his namesake. He was dressed in a crimson coat of heavy brushed velvet, as befitted his station. He paused frequently to run a sleeve across his sweaty brow. To my surprise, I recognized the judge from the temple as well. It was Mother Lillian. Priestesses were not often chosen to sit as judges. Usually the privilege was reserved for men. I wonder if she'd been picked because she had examined and prepared Allison's body, or if she'd used her age and irascibility to bully her way into the job. The Duke gestured to a ferrety-looking herald standing nearby. The little man took a deep breath which seemed to swell him to twice his size and announced, "Here opens the court of his dread Majesty Harold IV, this being an inquiry into the death of one Allison Tanner and the guilt or innocence in the matter of that death of one Lee, citizen of the Elf Nation, being heard by his grace, Duke Cyprian of Seaford, Master Arnold Glazier, and Mother Lillian of the Orders of St. Morgana the Merciful and St. Tanis the Healer." Whew. Deflated and red-faced, the herald withdrew. "Your Majesty," began Duke Cyprian, speaking first as was his right. "Good gentles, I would like to begin by explaining the sad circumstances that bring us here this morning. 5 days ago, a fisherman made an unexpected and horrifying catch. His net drew in the dead body of a young, fair-haired woman dressed in a blue gown. The fisherman wisely called for the city guard. They had already been looking for a missing girl named Allison, daughter of the late Roger Tanner. When the corpse was shown to Allison's household, they recognized her. These are the facts that are known. What we do not know, and what we wish to learn, is how that girl came to die, and by whose hand." The Duke paused to mop his brow. "A charge has been made against an elf named Lee," he continued. "He was a member of Allison's household. He was missing the night Allison was killed. Once Allison's body was discovered, he attempted to flee and hide. The city guard has been holding him. He may be brought forward now." 6 blue-liveried guards escorted Lee into the hall. It was almost comical. that tiny, skinny boy surrounded by half a dozen grim-looking soldiers. "I can't see, Eddie," Sadie whispered. Well, I wasn't about to lift her on my shoulders. "Shh," I whispered back. I was tall enough to see over the crowd, so I watched Lee stagger up before the judges. His captors had fitted him with a set of leg irons, and I winced in sympathy as I saw the bands cut into his slim calves with every step. "Are those chains really necessary?" were Duke Cyprian's first words to the court, once Lee finally made it to the front of the hall. "Your Grace," began the captain of the guard, "if he were to attempt to escape—" "How far could he get?" Cyprian interrupted. "How fast do you honestly think this child can run? Now don't be a fool. Take those things off him." The guards complied. Lee almost collapsed with relief. "Thank you, Your Grace," I barely heard him gasp above the murmuring crowd. "Thank you." Cyprian gestured for Lee to sit down in the chair provided him. Mother Lillian came forward with a copy of the great book in her hands. I was surprised the old woman could lift it. "Child," she said to Lee, "will you lay your hand upon this sacred book and swear that you are telling the truth?" Lee spoke up. "I am learning to read the books of your people. Out of the respect I have for my teacher, I will swear with my hand on your book that I will tell the truth as best I may." Mother Lillian raised her eyebrow at this, and the crowd rustled. But it seemed this oath was sufficient. The priestess withdrew, and Duke Cyprian took over again. "Child, what is your name?" "Wahelia," he sighed, like wind over a lake. "And who are your family?" "I have none. My mother is dead." "And your father?" I have no father." The murmuring of the crowd rose in pitch. Cyprian asked another question, but I couldn't hear it. "Quiet!" the big Duke bellowed, turning to the crowd. "If you want entertainment, go to a theater. I hear the Mystery is open tonight. We, however, are trying to conduct a trial." He mopped his brow and turned back to Lee. "Now, Leela." You may call me Lee, Your Grace," he said. "Thank you," the Duke said, smiling. "Lee, you have stated you have no living family. At the time of Alison's death, you were living with hers. Could you explain to His Majesty's court your relationship to this household?" "When my mother died," Lee said, "I left my clan and came to Belcamp to find work. I was a servant in the Tanner household. Master Roger, Alison's father, hired me. I have been with them about a year." "And what were your duties in this household?" asked the Duke. Lee shrugged. "Whatever they wished of me. I cleaned the shop, polished and put away tools. I helped Dolores, the housekeeper, with the cooking and the washing. I ran errands. I cleaned the fish pool. I fed the duck." At this point, Master Arnold stood up. "If I may, Your Grace," he said, stepping forward from the row of judges' chairs. "Of course," Cyprian said. "Young man," Master Arnold said, "is it not true that, in addition to the duties you mentioned, you were also working on the leather goods sold in that shop?" Lee hesitated. "Well, were you?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I had learned to work with leather when I was younger, still living with my clan," Lee said. "And I had some skill in decorating it. Carving, embossing, painting, that sort of thing." So you decorated boots and such, the glassblower said. Yes, Master Roger appreciated my work. Master Arnold, put in Duke Cyprian, pardon me, but I fail to see the point here. A moment, if you please, your grace, Arnold said. Lee, you helped to make boots and belts and other such wares for the shop. Were you given a share of the money when they were sold? You mean in addition to my wages? No. Why not? I'm not a guild member, Lee said. I'm an elf and an orphan. I cannot openly practice a craft in this kingdom. Duke Cyprian interrupted again. I still don't see how this matters. Your Grace, the guildman said, this person has just confessed to practicing a craft without a guild license. Duke Cyprian snorted. I'm sure he knew, as I did, that more often than not, guild laws were made to be evaded. It was a rare shop, I was sure, that did not employ a child, or a woman, or a bastard, or some other supposedly unsuitable person in place of a guild-licensed apprentice or master. Arnold, however, was a member of the Glassworkers Guild, whose rules were probably stricter than any others. To him, Lee's embellishing shoes without a license was almost as bad as murder, maybe worse. I had heard that glass workers who broke their guild laws had an unfortunate tendency to drown. We are not here to investigate the late Roger Tanner's questionable employment practices, Duke Cyprian said. We are investigating the death of his daughter. I was simply trying to establish the relationship between the members of the household, the guildsman said. Well, if I may continue, the Duke said. I could tell he had little patience for Master Arnold. So did the crowd. They were getting bored and restless. So, Lee, why don't you tell us the relationship, as Master Arnold put it, between the members of the household? Briefly, he added, raising one eyebrow at Arnold. Lee described all the members of the household and their relationships. Did you follow all of that? Cyprian asked the assembled crowd when Lee finished. The murdered girl was heir to one business, betrothed to the heir of another, but in love with a different man. So, Lee, what happened the day she died? Lee briefly described overhearing the fight between Malcolm and Allison, Allison's flight from the house, and the return of Allison's body the next day. The city guard returned the girl's corpse to the house, said Duke Cyprian. Then what happened? Lee shrugged. Everyone in the street came crowding around to get a look at her. Morbid, if you ask me. Yes, it's disgusting, the Duke agreed. But go on. Well, everyone was talking at once about what might have happened to her. I was hanging back in the shop door, and suddenly I realized they were talking about me. And what were they saying? The Duke asked. Lee faltered. That I had killed Allison, Your Grace. Did you? From the tone of his voice, I could tell he already believed Lee to be innocent. No, Your Grace, I did not. The boy paused, waiting for the crowd to quiet down. I liked Allison, Lee continued. She was, I don't know, a very loving person and cheerful mostly, and pleasant to be around. I mean, yes, she did have a temper, and she could be moody at times, especially since her father died, but for the most part, she was a very nice, ordinary girl. She was in love, and she was happy when she could be with Malcolm. and miserable when she couldn't. The Duke was smiling. Did this ordinary girl have any enemies? No, Your Grace. Anyone she quarreled with? She had quarreled constantly with her father over her betrothal before he died, but she loved him dearly. I think she thought he'd come around. Why? Well, because she was already past 16, and he hadn't had her marry yet, so she figured he could be talked out of it. This was the only long-standing argument she had with anyone? Yes, Your Grace. How about her betrothed? Did she ever argue with him? No, she said. He didn't want to marry her any more than she wanted to marry him. But they were fond of each other like a brother and sister. I can't see that he would ever have wanted to hurt her. How about her sweetheart? Malcolm, the journeyman. Did they ever quarrel? Lee paused. Well, did they? Yes, Lee said. After her father died, they quarreled constantly. But Allison was heartbroken. She was snapping at everyone. The last fight they had, the Duke said, before Allison fled the house, was that the same as all the others? No, Your Grace, Lee said. How was it different? It was much worse. Once again the Duke had to wait for the excited whispers of the crowd to die down before he continued. Obviously, he said with a glance around the hall, there are people in this court who would like to accuse the apprentice of killing Allison. He turned back to Lee. Do you think he could have? No, Lee said. He loved her. Besides, he added, Master Edward says she died by drowning at high tide in the sea off the cliffs north of town, and at high tide Malcolm was in a tavern on the south side of town. All right, the Duke said, breaking into Lee's speech. We'll let Master Edward give his own testimony later. He paused and rubbed his sleeve over his brow. So, Lee, what do you believe happened to Allison? Is this really an appropriate question? Arnold interrupted. I'd like to know what the boy thinks, the Duke said, since he lived in the house and knew everyone involved. Well, I think she was attacked by robbers. Why? The Duke asked. Her ring is missing. What ring? The Duke asked. A silver ring that Malcolm had given her, Lee said. She always wore it, but it wasn't on her hand when she was found. If I may be permitted to speak, Your Grace, Master Arnold put in, stepping forward again, I am not certain this line of questioning is aiding us. The Duke raised his eyebrows at this. So now you are accusing me of wasting the court's time. I am trying to establish this boy's story and as many other facts as possible. But begging Your Grace's pardon, I could tell Master Arnold was itching to argue with Cyprian if he could do it without being jailed himself for contempt to a peer of the realm. We are investigating this elf, not everyone else in town, he said, bearing that in mind. May I question him? Suit yourself, the Duke said. He retired to his chair, settling his bulk with a grunt. He flapped his sleeves to cool himself and gestured to a page to bring him a drink. It was terribly hot in the court hall. I could feel a bead of sweat rolling down my back beneath my shirt. Master Arnold took over the questioning. So, Elf, you say you didn't kill Allison. Can you prove it? Where were you that night? If it pleases you, Master, Lee said, countering Arnold's harsh manner with extreme politeness. "I was in a pasture with others of my kind, observing the solstice. The leader of my people will testify that I was there from sunset, when the ceremony began, until dawn." "The leader of the elves, I see," Arnold said, in a tone that implied he didn't think an elf's testimony worth much. From the rumbles I picked up from the crowd, many of them argued with him. "And that," he continued, "is your story? That you are frolicking with the elf folk until dawn, and that they will testify for you?" "Yes, master," Lee said. "Humph." Arnold was obviously unimpressed. "When did you find out Allison had been murdered?" he asked. "When her body was brought home the next afternoon." "What did you do then?" Lee paused for a moment. "Everyone was so excited and angry. I heard people say my name, say I'd killed her, and I panicked and I ran." "You ran," the guildsman repeated. "To Master Edwards. He's been teaching me to read. I thought he'd help me." Which, of course, leads one to speculate why this Edward person was teaching an elf, someone else's servant at that, to read, and what his involvement in this matter was. Master Arnold said. "You keep mentioning his name. Who is he? And what does he have to do with you and the Tanners?" Sadie leaned against me and whispered, "I don't like his tone." "Shh," I hissed. I wanted to hear what Lee was saying. "Master Edward is a wizard," Lee explained. "I met him when he read my master's cards. I asked him if he could teach me to read, and he agreed." "Why?" Arnold asked. "Why did I want to learn to read? Or why did he teach me? Both." Lee paused. "I wanted to learn to read because I was curious about all the saints and the history of the kingdom. And I don't know, I just wanted to learn things." He held his little chin up proudly. "Many things in this city are still strange to me. People always quote the books of faith when they want to prove something. I wanted to read them myself." "What?" Arnold said. "So you could argue with your betters?" Sadie nudged me again. "I really don't like this man's tone." Apparently Duke Cyprian was not impressed by it either. He hoisted himself off his seat and moved to loom over the glass blower. "I am certain," he rumbled, "that the young elf was moved to learn to read from a sincere desire for moral and spiritual improvement." I could glimpse old Mother Lillian, seated quietly at the table, smiling to herself. "And I am also certain that this wizard had no intention either to subvert kingdom guild laws by teaching an elf to read, or conspire to murder a young woman. He can speak for himself later. Right now, all I want to hear is what this young person can tell us about the day Allison Tanner died." He looked pointedly at Arnold. Sadie elbowed me sharply. "Put him in his place, didn't he?" "Shh." Duke Cyprian began questioningly again. "You said that she and Malcolm were fighting before she left the house. Do you know what they fought about?" "No." "But you heard them fighting?" I was downstairs," Lee said, "with Dolores, helping her prepare supper. I heard voices, but I didn't hear what they said." "Could you tell us exactly what you did hear?" Cyprian asked. "Well," said Lee, pausing to think, "I wasn't really listening at first, but they were up in the back bedroom, Alice had been sorting through Master Roger's things, and Malcolm had gone up to help her, I suppose. They were talking quietly at first, but then I heard Allison raise her voice and breaking glass. Breaking glass? Repeated the Duke. Lee nodded. Yes, one of them broke a window, and they were both shouting and screaming, but we couldn't make out what they said. Then Allison came running down the stairs in tears, and that was the last time I ever saw her. Alive, that is. He looked expectantly at Duke Cyprian. Do you want to know anything else, Your Grace? Just one thing. Could you describe what Allison was wearing that day when she left the house? Her blue dress, Lee said. She usually wore a white cap when she went out, but she forgot it that day. Thank you, Lee, the Duke said. Guards, let him sit there. He pointed to the scribe's bench, near where Mother Lillian was sitting. And for mercy's sake, don't chain him, he added in disgust, as one of the guards picked up the leg irons again. Malcolm came before the Duke, looking sulky and sullen. It was hard at first to hear what he was saying, as he was mumbling and staring at the ground. Most of his testimony was identical to Lee's, but when he came to the part about his fight with Allison, he hesitated. You say you had an argument? Prompted the Duke. What was it about? The young man muttered something, and a hush fell over the crowd as they strained to hear. What was that? I don't think His Majesty could hear you. I said she wouldn't have me, he shouted. She refused to marry me. And that was why you fought? Yes, he said, lapsing into a sulk again. Why did she refuse, Malcolm? The Duke asked. Does it matter? Malcolm snapped. It might, the Duke said. Well, I didn't kill her, Malcolm cried. I didn't say you did, the Duke said. I just want to know all I can about what happened that last day. Malcolm sighed. I was beginning to feel sorry for him. This had to be hideously painful. She said, he began, she said she wanted to abide by her dead father's wishes and marry Dennis, even though she didn't love him. That couldn't be right, I thought. Dennis said she'd broken the engagement. One of the men was lying. And you tried to argue her out of it. Malcolm's gaze went everywhere but to the Duke. I wonder if he might be crying. She didn't love him, I thought he heard him say. She loved me. The Duke continued questioning. And what about the broken glass? Young Lee says a window pane was broken. I did it. I put my fist through it. You were that angry? That must have hurt, the Duke said. What happened after that? You already know, Malcolm said with resignation of a man being taken to the gallows. She ran out. I ran after her. You didn't catch her? Asked the Duke. No, you know I didn't. I never saw her again. But she can't have been that far ahead of you. I didn't go after her right away. I was confused. I was angry. I just put my hand through a window. I didn't kill her, he protested. For God's sake, I was the one who set the guard looking for her. Would I have done that if I'd killed her? I didn't kill Allison. Once more, Sadie hissed up at my ear. I'm not sure now as he didn't. He couldn't have, I remembered. He was in the tavern, waiting to beat me up, remember? Oh, right, love. I tried to hear what Malcolm was saying now. The Duke, who, judging from his expression, must have been feeling as sorry for the poor fellow as I was, repeated his words. You say you went to a tavern when you couldn't find Allison? Malcolm nodded. At what time? The Duke asked. Had the sun set yet? It was just setting when I got there. And you stayed there all night? Mostly, Malcolm answered. Dolores saw me when I came home, and people can vouch that you were there in the tavern. Yes, Malcolm answered, with a faint ghost of a smile. I myself was not particularly amused. Is there anything else you can tell us? The Duke asked. Do you have any ideas what happened to Allison? Malcolm shook his head, once again staring at the floor. Anything that might be of help to us. Help? Malcolm spat. Allison's dead. Nothing can help that now. His voice broke. I could see tears on his face. Why are you hounding me? I've lost the only person who ever mattered to me. Haven't I suffered enough? I meant, the Duke continued gently, anything that might help us find out who killed her. I don't know who killed her, he exclaimed. His stare darted around the hall now like that of a trapped animal. I don't know. Maybe it was that damn wizard. He's always lurking about. I almost laughed at this. I found it absurd that anyone could imagine a man of my size with my red hair and bright clothes lurking. I'm about as inconspicuous as a woolly elephant in a group of convent sisters. Do you mean the Master Edward young Lee spoke of? The Duke asked. Yes, Malcolm said. He does seem to be involved somehow. What exactly do you mean by lurking about? He came into the tavern I was in the night Allison... He faltered. The night she died. He was acting terribly drunk, but I think he was faking it. I think he was following me. Why do you think that? Did you speak to him? The Duke asked. Malcolm actually smirked at this. I knocked him on his fat ass. The audience reacted quite noisily to this. I had to restrain Sadie. Why? The Duke asked when the commotion died down. I told you. I think he was following me. And why would he want to do that, do you think? Malcolm's face darkened, but he said nothing. Why would he have followed you that night, Malcolm? The Duke asked. I don't know, he said slowly, but I'm sure he has his reasons. What I do know, he continued, is that he was at the tavern that night. And 2 days later, when I went to the temple to bring Allison home, he was there in the crypt, trying to do something unnatural to her body. The crowd exploded. I cringed, trying to make myself as small and inconspicuous as possible, while Sadie tugged on my sleeve and demanded, What is that fool saying? The Duke was shouting for order. I could hear Lee's shrill, childish protests above the uproar. Finally, the populace settled down enough for Mother Lillian to come forward and speak. Your Grace, she said, I was on duty at the temple that day. The wizard Edward Red Mage was examining the girl's body in an attempt to discover how and where she had died. I believe it would be helpful to call him forward. And so we shall, Mother, when I have finished hearing the testimony of Malcolm here. You have still not told me, he said, turning back to the journeyman, why you think the wizard was following you. I'll bet he murdered Allison, he said. Probably planned it all with that deceitful little elf. They're so damn close, they're probably lovers. It took the Duke twice as long to quiet the crowd after that little thunderbolt. I would have liked the earth to swallow me. I would have at least crawled under my bench, but I had to wrestle Sadie bodily to keep her from rushing up to throttle Malcolm. Lee, sitting next to the court scribe, was turning an odd shape of deep chalky green. Now, the Duke bellowed once his voice could be heard, any more outbursts like that, and I will have this court cleared. Is that understood? I could hear the crowd breathing. Very well, the Duke said, mopping his brow. Now, welcome. That's an interesting theory that you have there. Malcolm laughed. Not so odd as thou that, he said. I told you the elf was deceitful. You had the little bastard up here under oath. And did the wretch think to mention to you she was a woman? One person squawked out in surprise and was instantly silenced by a companion. No one wanted to miss this. I stood there gawping like a fish as Sadie said, Oh, God, why do you have to go and tell him that? I turned to Sadie. Is it true? He's a girl? And you knew it? I mentally kicked myself for being a blind idiot. Well, of course she's a girl. Couldn't you tell? I shook my head and turned back to the trial, afraid I might miss something. Lee himself, herself, had collapsed from the bench to her knees, eyes blank with what could only be terror. Duke Cyprian turned to her. Is that true, Lee? He said. Are you a woman? She could only nod feebly, eyes welling with tears. And you didn't see fit to tell this to His Majesty's court because... Oh, please, Your Grace, she sobbed. You didn't ask me. The Duke smiled. That is true, we didn't. So would you like to tell us now why you chose to practice this little deception? Your Grace, Your Majesty, I have no one, she cried. No father, no brothers, no one. Tears were streaming down her face. I'm only half elf. My mother was raped. She cast herself face down on the floor. Please, I beg you have pity on me. It all made terrible sense, of course. An elf boy with no friends or family could at least get a place in the city as a menial servant. But an elf maid in the same situation would have only one course open to her. Get up, said the Duke kindly, helping Lee rise from the ground. Mother Lillian, would you please take charge of this poor unfortunate for the remainder of the trial? He turned to the balcony. Your Majesty, I think you will agree with me when I suggest we take a short recess now. Malcolm, I believe we have heard all we need from you for the moment. You are dismissed, but don't leave the court. Nettie, he bellowed to his page boy, get me a drink. See you next week.